What if your job description involved keeping the living out and kicking the dead out? My latest gig was as a bouncer at the Limbo Lounge, a supernatural club situated between worlds. Every decision meant the difference between salvation and unspeakable horror, and the rules of engagement were written in fear. This isn't just a story, it's a desperate gamble against damnation. I never planned on working security for the afterlife. Honestly, I was just looking for enough cash to keep my landlord from throwing my meager belongings onto the humid pavement of downtown Tampa. The heat in Florida is a physical weight, a wet blanket that smothers you until you can't breathe, and my desperation felt exactly the same. I was sitting in a diner at 3 a.m., nursing a coffee that tasted like battery acid, staring at the help wanted section of a newspaper that someone had left behind. That was when the air in the diner changed. The hum of the refrigerator died down, the buzzing of the flies against the window pane ceased, and a man slid into the booth opposite me. He didn't introduce himself, not at first. He just placed a card on the table. It was black, made of a material that felt more like cold slate than paper, with silver embossed letters that seemed to writhe if you looked at them too long. The Limbo Lounge. Beneath the name, an address that led to the middle of nowhere, deep in the Everglades, and an hourly wage that made my eyes water. It was an impossible amount of money for a doorman gig. Mr. Sterling, the man said. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He wore a white suit that was impeccably clean, despite the grime of the diner. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his eyes were a disturbing shade of milky violet. We have a vacancy. You fit the profile. What profile? I asked, my voice cracking. Desperate. Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach those strange eyes. Malleable, capable of violence, yet restrained by fear. Be at the coordinates by sundown tomorrow. Wear black. Bring nothing. He stood up and walked out before I could ask another question. When I looked back at the table, the card was still there, cold to the touch. I should have thrown it away. I should have run. But when you're broke and alone in a state that eats the weak, you don't ask questions about golden tickets, even if they're handed to you by a corpse in a designer suit. The drive out the next evening was a descent into madness. I took Alligator Alley, turning off onto an unmarked gravel road that snaked deep into the swamp. The Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like ragged shrouds, gray and ghostly in the twilight. The further I drove, the thicker the fog became. It wasn't normal fog. It smelled of sulfur and ozone, a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. My GPS had died 5 miles back, spinning in circles before the screen cracked down the center on its own accord. Just when I thought I was going to drive my beat-up sedan into a sinkhole, the trees cleared. There it was, the Limbo Lounge. In the daylight, it probably looked like a condemned plantation house, rotting into the mud. But under the light of a moon that looked too large and too red, it was alive. Neon lights that shouldn't have had power buzzed with a sickly green hue, spelling out the name above a massive set of double doors made of dark, polished mahogany. The building seemed to pulse, a low, thrumming bass that I could feel in the fillings of my teeth. It was like standing next to the heart of a giant, sleeping beast. I parked and walked toward the entrance. A velvet rope, thick and crimson, was already set up. Standing by a podium was Sterling. He looked at his watch, an antique pocket watch that ticked with a sound like breaking bones. You are punctual, Elias, Sterling said. Good. Punctuality is a survival trait here. What is this place? I asked, looking around. The swamp was silent. No crickets, no frogs, just the oppressive hum of the club. A waypoint, Sterling said, handing me a clipboard. A rest stop on the highway to eternity. Some souls aren't ready to move on. Some are waiting for a ride that hasn't arrived. They come here to drink, to forget, to wait. Your job is to ensure order. He tapped the clipboard with a long, manicured fingernail. These are the rules. Read them. Memorize them. If you break them, I cannot save you. In fact, if you break them, I will likely be the one to dispose of what's left of you. I looked down at the paper. The ink was red, rust red. Rule 1. The living are strictly forbidden. If they breathe, they leave. If they persist, you must remove them. Rule 2. The dead must settle their tabs. No soul leaves the premises without payment. Rule 3. Do not look the weeper in the eyes. Rule 4. If the music stops, lock the doors from the outside and hide. The list went on, each rule more bizarre and terrifying than the last. I laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. Is this a joke? Is this some kind of immersive theater thing? Sterling grabbed my wrist. His grip was like a steel vise, freezing cold. Listen to me, Elias. The veil is thin here. Tonight is a full moon. The pressure is high. You will see things that your mind will try to reject. Do not let them in. If a living human enters that club, the patrons will tear them apart. If a patron escapes into the swamp, well, the consequences are far worse. He let go of me and straightened his tie. I will be in the office. Do not disturb me unless the proprietor arrives, and pray he does not. With that, he vanished inside, the heavy doors slamming shut with a finality that made me jump. I was alone. I stood there for 10 minutes, the humidity soaking through my shirt, telling myself I could still leave. I could get in my car and drive until the gas ran out. But then, the first car arrived. It was a 1950s Cadillac, pristine and black, gliding silently over the gravel. It stopped, and the driver got out. He was a tall man, wearing a tuxedo that was damp with something dark. He walked toward the rope, his movements jerky, unnatural. As he stepped into the sickly green light of the neon sign, I saw the side of his head. It was caved in, the skull shattered, bits of bone gleaming white against the dark, matted hair. My stomach lurched violently. I stepped back, my hand flying to my mouth. The man stopped at the velvet rope and looked at me. His eyes were glazed, staring past me into a distance I couldn't see. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a coin, gold, heavy, and ancient. He held it out. Cover charge, he rasped. The sound was wet, bubbling up through a throat that shouldn't have been able to produce speech. I froze. My brain was screaming corpse, corpse, run, run, but my body was paralyzed. This was it. The job interview wasn't the talk with Sterling. It was this moment. Can you stand in the face of death and ask for ID? I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I remember the debt collectors. I remember the eviction notice. I took the coin. It was ice cold. Go in, I whispered, unhooking the rope. The man shambled past me, the smell of formaldehyde and rot washing over me in a suffocating wave. He pushed open the doors, and for a split second, I heard the music inside. It wasn't jazz or techno. It was a cacophony of whispers, 1,000 voices overlapping in a dissonant choir of regrets. That was the start. Within an hour, the line stretched back into the fog. They came from the swamp. They came in phantom cars. They walked out of the darkness of the treeline. Some looked normal until they smiled and you saw too many teeth. Others made no attempt to hide their ends. Drowning victims dripping swamp water that never dried. Burned victims still smoldering with phantom embers. I fell into a trance of terror. Check the list. Check the toll. Open the rope. Close the rope. Don't look too closely. Then, the first real test happened. A group of 4 college kids, maybe 20 years old, came stumbling out of the woods. They were laughing, holding beer cans, clearly drunk and lost. They weren't glowing with that pale, ethereal light the patrons had. They were flushed with heat and life. They were breathing. Whoa. One of the guys yelled, spotting the neon sign. Dude, look at this place. Is this a rave? They jogged toward the entrance, their footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel. Too loud. The patrons in line, the silent, gray figures waiting for entry, slowly turned their heads in unison. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees in a second. Hey man, the kid said, walking right up to me. How much to get in? We got cash. I stepped in front of the rope, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the line of dead things behind them. The man in the tuxedo was back, watching from the doorway. His jaw hung slack, but his eyes were fixated on the girl in the group, focused on the pulse beating in her neck. Rule 1. The living are strictly forbidden. Close private party. I said, my voice shaking. You need to leave. Now. Come on. Don't be a jerk, the girl said, stepping closer. She tried to peer past me. It looks packed in there. It's not for you. I snapped, harsher than I intended. I could feel the malice radiating from the line behind me. The patrons weren't just watching. They were hungry. The energy coming off them was predatory. If these kids stepped 1 foot past that velvet rope, they wouldn't just be killed. They would be consumed. What's your problem? The first guy said, puffing his chest out. He reached for the rope. We're going in. I grabbed his arm. His skin was warm. It was shocking how different it felt from the coin I had held earlier. Listen to me. I hissed, leaning in so only he could hear. Look at the guy behind you. Really look at him. The kid frowned, confused, but he glanced over my shoulder. He looked at the woman standing first in line. She was wearing a 1920s flapper dress. She looked beautiful until she noticed him looking. She smiled, and her head lolled unnaturally to the side, revealing the deep, purple bruise of a broken neck and the rope burn etched into her skin. She licked her lips with a tongue that was black and swollen. The color drained from the kid's face so fast I thought he might faint. He scrambled back, tripping over his own feet. Go, I roared. Run. They didn't argue. The primal instinct kicked in, the lizard brain recognizing a predator. They turned and sprinted back into the dark woods, their screams of terror fading into the night. I turned back to the line. The woman with the broken neck was staring at me. She looked disappointed. Not on the list, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to act like the authority figure Sterling expected me to be. She didn't speak. She just handed me a silver coin and glided past. My hand was shaking so bad I almost dropped the clipboard. I checked my watch. It was only 11 p.m. I had 7 more hours of this. 7 more hours of gatekeeping hell. But the night was young, and the rules were about to get a lot more complicated. I thought keeping the living out was the hard part. I was wrong. The hard part was about to begin, because the things inside, some of them were starting to realize that the door swung both ways. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the swamp air. I looked down at the clipboard again. Rule 2. The dead must settle their tabs. The heavy mahogany doors creaked open slightly, not for a guest entering, but for something pushing from the inside. A hand curled around the edge of the doorframe. It wasn't human. The fingers were elongated, translucent, and tipped with obsidian claws. Sterling had warned me about the Weeper. He had warned me about the living. But he hadn't told me what to do when the things that lived in the darkness between the worlds decided they wanted a breath of fresh air. I gripped the velvet rope, my knuckles white. The night shift at the Limbo Lounge had officially begun, and I had a feeling that by sunrise, I'd be wishing I was the one on the other side of the door. The silence that followed the retreat of those college kids was heavier than the humid Florida air. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a vacuum, a holding of breath. The line of patrons, the grays, the broken, the wet, and the burned, stared at me. Their eyes were devoid of sympathy. They were waiting to see if I had the stomach for the rest of the night. I adjusted my collar, which felt like a noose, and looked down at the clipboard. The red ink of the rules seemed to pulse under the flickering neon light. Rule 1. The living are strictly forbidden. I had survived the first test, but I quickly learned that identifying the living wasn't always as easy as spotting a pulse or a flush of blood in the cheeks. The obvious ones, the shambling wrecks of trauma victims, were easy to process. You took their coin, you avoided looking at their wounds, and you opened the rope. But the fresh, that's what Sterling called them in the footnotes, were a nightmare. Around midnight, a man walked up to the velvet rope. He was wearing a sharp, navy blue business suit, a Rolex glinting on his wrist, and polished Oxfords that crunched softly on the gravel. He didn't look dead. He looked like he had just stepped out of a boardroom meeting in Miami. His skin had color. His posture was upright. He even smiled at me, a charming, practiced grin that showed perfect, white teeth. "Evening," he said, his voice smooth, carrying the arrogance of a man used to getting into exclusive clubs. "One for the lounge." He reached into his pocket. My hand instinctively went to the rope, ready to unhook it. He looked more alive than I did. But then, a breeze kicked up from the swamp, rustling the sawgrass and carrying that scent of sulfur. The wind hit us both. I shivered. His hair didn't move. I froze. I looked closer. The tie he was wearing, it was perfectly knotted, but it was too tight. Much too tight. And his eyes, while blue and clear, didn't blink. Not once. I asked, my voice barely a croak. "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed, stepping closer. "Do you know who I am?" He invaded my personal space, expecting me to back down. That was when I felt it, or rather, didn't feel it. There was no body heat radiating from him. In the oppressive 90-degree heat of the Everglades, he was a void of temperature, a walking cold spot. I looked down at his neck. Just above the collar of his expensive shirt, there was a faint, purple line. A ligature mark. "Cover charge," I said, hardening my voice. I couldn't treat him like a person. If I treated them like people, I would lose my mind. I had to treat them like cargo. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated misery. The illusion of life shattered. His skin gray-scaled in front of my eyes, the color draining away like water down a drain. He reached into his pocket and produced a coin, but his hand was shaking now. "I didn't mean to do it," he whispered, the smooth baritone replaced by a ragged wheeze. "I just wanted the noise to stop." "Inside," I said, taking the coin. It burned with a freezing cold that stung my palm. He walked past me, and as he crossed the threshold, the back of his suit jacket flapped open. There was nothing underneath. No back, No spine, just a hollow cavity filled with swirling gray mist. I gagged, turning away and squeezing my eyes shut for a second. That was the trap of Rule 1. The dead lie. They lie to themselves, and they lie to you. They try to project the image of who they were, desperate to cling to the memory of breath. My job wasn't just security, it was truth verification. I had to look past the glamour and find the rot. But if Rule 1 was a psychological game, Rule 2 was a physical war. Rule 2, the terrifying door to damnation policy for those trying to escape. About 2 hours into the shift, the rhythm changed. The line had thinned out slightly, but the noise from inside the club had grown louder. The thumping bass was now accompanied by screams. Not screams of fear, but of ecstatic, maniacal release. It sounded like a riot in a slaughterhouse. The heavy mahogany doors flew open with a bang that echoed across the swamp. A woman stumbled out. She was wearing a hospital gown, her feet bare and muddy. She wasn't trying to get in. She was sprinting for the tree, her eyes wide with a terror that eclipsed anything I had seen so far. "Help me!" she shrieked, spotting me. "They're eating them. They're eating the souls." She scrambled toward me, grabbing my shirt. Her grip was desperate, her fingernails digging into my skin. "You have to let me go. I'm not supposed to be here. It was a mistake." I looked at the doorway. Standing in the shadows was a massive figure. It was 7 feet tall, wearing a bouncer's suit that strained against unnatural muscles. Its head was a smooth, featureless dome of flesh. No eyes, no nose, just a vertical slit for a mouth. It didn't step outside. It just stood there, waiting. I looked back at the woman. She was crying blood. Thick, dark tears that stained the white gown. "Please," she begged, "let me leave." I remembered the footnote under Rule 2. If a patron escapes into the living world, the breach must be sealed. The price of the breach is the gatekeeper's soul. Me, I was the gatekeeper. If she got past me and made it to the highway, if she haunted a living person or caused a wreck, the debt was on my head. And Sterling had been very clear about how debts were collected. "I can't," I said, my voice trembling. "You can't go back. You're dead." "No," she screamed, shoving me. She was strong, fueled by the hysteria of the damned. She knocked me back against the podium and took off running toward the gravel road. "Stop," I yelled, scrambling to my feet. "Don't go into the swamp." It wasn't just about the rule. It was about what waited in the dark. The Limbo Lounge was a sanctuary of sorts, a controlled chaos. The swamp outside, that was unregulated territory. That was the wild west of the afterlife. She didn't listen. She hit the edge of the light cast by the neon sign. The moment her bare foot touched the darkness beyond the gravel, the water in the ditch alongside the road exploded. It wasn't an alligator. It was something long, pale, and multi-limbed. It moved with the speed of a whip crack. A tentacle, slick with black slime and covered in hooked suckers, wrapped around her waist. She barely had time to scream before she was yanked off her feet. She was dragged into the murky water with such violence that her body folded in half. There was a splash, a brief churning of the black water, and then silence. I stood there, panting, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had failed to stop her physically, but the house had corrected the error. I looked back at the door. The faceless bouncer nodded at me, a slow, terrifying inclination of its smooth head, and stepped back inside, closing the heavy doors. I dry heaved, leaning over the velvet rope. I understood now. I wasn't keeping them in to be cruel. I was keeping them in because the things that lurked in the outer dark of the swamp were worse than whatever purgatory waited inside the lounge. The door to damnation wasn't a club entrance. It was the exit. Leaving without a pass meant becoming food for the bottom feeders of the spirit world. I barely had time to recover before the next crisis hit. The consequences of breaking the rules weren't always instant death. Sometimes they were psychological torture. A car pulled up. It was a hearse, a vintage 1930s model with curtains in the windows. The driver didn't get out. Instead, the back door swung open. A small boy stepped out. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He was wearing a baseball uniform, dusty and stained with grass and blood. He held a glove in one hand and a coin in the other. "Is my dad here?" he asked. His voice was small, innocent. I felt my heart break. I had to enforce the rules, but looking at a dead child was a different kind of horror. "I don't know, kid," I whispered. "He said he'd pick me up after the game," the boy said. He looked at the club. "Is he in there?" He tried to duck under the rope. Rule 5. Minors are to be redirected to the white gate. Admission to the lounge is denied. I hadn't read that far down the list until just that moment. I scrambled to block his path. "Hey, hold on, buddy," I said, dropping to one knee. I try to make myself look less threatening. "You can't go in there. It's for grown-ups." "But I have to find him," the boy insisted, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm scared." "I know," I said. "I know." Suddenly, the neon sign above us buzzed angrily. The green light shifted to a harsh, warning red. The ground beneath my feet vibrated. The house was losing patience. It wanted the boy gone, or it wanted him consumed. "Listen to me," I said, speaking fast. "You see that light? Way over there." I pointed to the east, where the faintest glimmer of a white star hung low in the sky, distinct from the swamp fog. I didn't know if it was real or if I was hallucinating, but the clipboard said redirect. "Go to that light." I lied, or prayed. "Your dad is waiting there. Not here. This is the wrong place." The boy looked at the light, then back at me. "Promise." "I promise," I choked out. He nodded, put his coin back in his pocket, and turned away. He began to walk toward the distant star. As he moved away from the lounge, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lighten around him. He didn't vanish into the swamp. He seemed to fade into the mist, peaceful and slow. I slumped against the podium. I had saved him from the lounge. I had followed the rule, but the emotional toll was racking up. Every interaction chipped away a little piece of my sanity. "Soft heart, Elias." The voice came from right beside my ear. I jumped, spinning around. Sterling was standing there. I hadn't heard him approach. He was holding a glass of amber liquid that smoked when the air touched it. I followed the protocol," I stammered. "You did," Sterling agreed, taking a sip, "but barely. You hesitated with the runner, and you got emotionally involved with the stray." He stepped closer, his violet eyes boring into mine. "This place feeds on emotion, Elias. Fear, regret, sorrow. If you give it yours, it will drain you dry before sunrise. You are the wall. Walls do not feel." He reached out and tapped the clipboard. "Read Rule 6, and pray you don't have to use it tonight." He turned and walked back inside, vanishing into the cacophony of the club. I looked down at the clipboard, my sweat dripping onto the paper. Rule 6. If the weeper approaches the door, you must offer a trade, a memory for a passage. If you have no happy memories left, she takes your eyes. I swallowed hard. A trade. As if on cue, the temperature plummeted. The swamp water froze over with a cracking sound. The neon lights flickered and died, plunging the entrance into darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the gravel. From the darkness of the road, a figure approached. It was draped in black veils, floating inches above the ground. The sound of sobbing, deep, wrenching, soul-destroying sobbing, filled the air. The weeper had arrived. I stood alone in the dark, clutching the velvet rope like a lifeline. I racked my brain, searching for a happy memory, something bright and pure enough to satisfy a monster. But standing there, at the threshold of hell, with the smell of death in my nose and the blood of the damned on my hands, I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I couldn't remember a single good thing. The sobbing got louder. She was at the rope. I closed my eyes, but I knew that wouldn't save me. I had to negotiate, or I was going to lose the ability to see forever. "Ticket, please," I whispered into the void. The veil lifted. The veil lifted, and for a moment, the humid Florida night ceased to exist. There was no swamp, no neon sign, no gravel beneath my feet. There was only the face of the weeper, or rather, the absence of one. Where a face should have been, there was a swirling vortex of gray mist, damp and smelling of old rain and funerals. In the center of that mist floated two eyes, human, terrified, and weeping tears of thick black tar. They weren't her eyes. I realized with a sick lurch of my stomach that they were stolen. They were the eyes of the last doorman who hadn't followed the rules. Betrayed, the voice whispered, echoing directly inside my skull. It sounded like the rustle of dry flowers on a grave. "Give me the light, Elias. Give me the warmth." I stood frozen, the velvet rope slippery in my sweating palms. Rule 6. Offer a trade. A memory for a passage. I had to give her something happy, a piece of my soul to buy my safety. I scrambled through my mind, panic seizing my thoughts like a seizure. My childhood, most of it was poverty and neglect. My recent years, debt, failure, loneliness. The weeper leaned closer, the cold radiating from her form, freezing the sweat on my brow. The tar tears dripped onto the gravel, sizzling like acid. I remember, I stammered, my voice cracking. I latched onto a fragment, a tiny shard of gold in a sea of gray. I was 7 years old. It was a rare good day. My mother had taken me to the beach in Clearwater. The sun was setting, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple. We were eating ice cream, the cheap kind that melts too fast. She was laughing. She looked healthy. She looked happy. "Take it," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut, projecting the image with everything I had. "Take the sunset." I felt a physical pull, a hook sinking into the frontal lobe of my brain. It wasn't pain, exactly. It was a violation. It felt like someone was reaching into my chest and pulling a rib out through my throat. I gasped, falling to my knees. The image of the sunset flared bright white in my mind's eye, and then it was gone. Not just the image, the feeling. I knew, intellectually, that I had gone to the beach with my mother. I knew we had ice cream, but the warmth, the love, the specific shade of the sky, it was deleted, scrubbed clean. It was like reading a biography of a stranger. I opened my eyes, gasping for air. The weeper was standing upright, the mist swirling slower now. She seemed satisfied. She glided past me, the black veils trailing over my shaking hands. As she crossed the threshold, the heavy doors opened for her, and for a second, The wailing inside the club stopped, replaced by a respectful silence. I remained on my knees in the gravel, shivering in the 90-degree heat. I had survived. I had kept my eyes. But I had lost something precious, something I could never get back. That was my first shift. I thought it was the worst it could get. I was naive. That first night was an initiation, a baptism by fire and fear. But as the nights turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I learned that the Weeper was just one archetypal horror in a menagerie of nightmares. The Limbo Lounge wasn't just a bar. It was a pressure cooker, and sometimes the things inside try to blow the lid off. One of the most terrifying shifts happened about a month in. I had grown somewhat accustomed to the rhythm. Check the list, check the coin, check for the pulse. I had become numb to the sight of gaping wounds and missing limbs. I was efficient. Complacency, however, is a death sentence in the Everglades. It was a Tuesday, usually a slow night for the damned. The fog was particularly thick, rolling off the swamp in waves that obscured the road. I was leaning against the podium, swatting at mosquitoes that seemed immune to bug spray, when the doors behind me burst open. This wasn't the slow, respectful exit of a satisfied ghost. This was an explosion of motion. A figure came barreling out, stumbling, crashing into the velvet rope. It was a man, or the shade of one. He was glowing with a frantic, pulsating red light. His mouth was open so wide his jaw seemed unhinged, and he was screaming. But it wasn't a human scream. It was a high-pitched frequency, a sonic drill that shattered the glass of the neon sign above us. Shards of green glass rained down like confetti. "Let me back," he shrieked, the sound vibrating in my teeth. "I'm not finished. I have to tell her." This was a screaming soul. Sterling had warned me about them in a memo I had skimmed. They were spirits who died in the middle of a frantic argument or a moment of high-stakes panic. They were batteries of kinetic energy, unstable and desperate to return to the living world to finish their business. "Get back inside," I yelled, covering my ears. My nose started to bleed, the pressure in my head building to a crescendo. "Get out of my way," the soul roared. He lunged at me. Unlike the Weeper, he was solid, dense with rage. He hit me like a linebacker, knocking the wind out of me. We tumbled onto the gravel. His hands were around my throat, and they burned like dry ice. "I need to go back," he screamed into my face. His eyes were spinning whirlpools of madness. "She doesn't know where the money is hid. She'll starve." I struggled, kicking at him, but he was anchored by his obsession. My vision started to tunnel. The edges of the world went black. I was going to die here, strangled by a ghost worried about his life insurance. My body left to be eaten by the swamp things. Then, I remembered the salt shot. Sterling had given me a modified taser, claiming it was loaded with rock salt blessed by a priest who had lost his faith. I fumbled for my belt, my fingers numb. The screaming soul tightened his grip, his scream rising to a pitch that made my vision blur. I drew the weapon and jammed it into his ribs. I pulled the trigger. There was a crack of thunder, localized entirely within his spectral form. The soul convulsed, his red glow flickering violently. He shrieked, a sound of pure agony, and blasted backward, flying off me and slamming into the closed mahogany doors. He hit the wood with a wet thud and slid down, his form dissipating into a pile of glowing ash. I lay on the gravel, gasping, massaging my freezing throat. The ash on the doorstep swirled in the wind and was sucked back under the crack of the door. The house always reclaimed its own. I learned that night that pity was a luxury I couldn't afford. If I had listened to his plea, if I had sympathized with his need to save his wife, he would have possessed me. He would have worn my skin like a suit to walk out of there. But if the screaming soul was an assault on the senses, the malicious mime was an assault on reality itself. It happened 3 months into the job. The novelty had worn off, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. I was running on caffeine and fear. The line was empty. The swamp was quiet. Too quiet. I looked down the road and saw him walking toward me. He was wearing the classic getup: black and white striped shirt, suspenders, a beret, and face paint. But the paint was cracked, peeling like old drywall, and his eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises. Just holes. He didn't walk. He glided, lifting his knees high in an exaggerated, mocking march. He stopped to the velvet rope and didn't speak. He just smiled, a tear in the fabric of reality. Name? I asked, tired. Cover charge. The mom held up a hand, palm flat, pressing against the air. He pretended to be trapped in a box. It was the oldest cliche in the book. I sighed, reaching for my clipboard. Look, pal, if you don't have a coin, you beat it. I'm not in the mood for charades. The mom's smile widened. He pointed at me, then pointed at himself. He mimed taking a key, inserting it into his chest, and turning it. Then he pointed at me again. Suddenly, I couldn't breathe. I clawed at my throat. It felt like an invisible hand was clamping my windpipe shut. I tried to gasp, to yell, but no sound came out. The silence was absolute. The swamp noises, the cicadas, the distant splash of gators, cut out instantly. I was in a vacuum. The mime stepped over the velvet rope. He didn't pay. He didn't show ID. He just kept walking, his movements jerky and grotesque. As he passed me, he paused and leaned in. He mimed wiping a tear from his cheek, mocking the weeper, mocking me. I fell against the podium, my lungs burning. He was stealing my breath. He was stealing the sound of the world. He was a silencer, a rare entity that fed on the sensory input of others. He wanted her the club, not to suffer, but to feed on the screams inside. I knew I couldn't physically fight him. I couldn't even touch him. He existed in a pocket of distorted reality. I had to beat him at his own game. My vision was spotting. I needed air. I forced myself to stand. I looked at his back as he reached for the door handle. I raised my hand and mimmed the lasso. I threw it. It was insane. It was desperate. But in the Limbo Lounge, belief shapes reality. I believed I was holding a rope. I yanked back with all my strength. The mime jerked backward, his head snapping back as if caught in a noose. He spun around, his black eyes widening in genuine surprise. The invisible grip on my throat loosened just a fraction, enough for me to suck in a ragged gasp of humid air. No, entry, I wheezed. I'm pulling the rope hand over hand, dragging him back toward the velvet rope. He clawed at his neck, struggling against nothing. He planted his feet, miming a heavy weight, trying to anchor himself. It was a battle of wills, fought in pantomime. I gritted my teeth, sweat stinging my eyes. I am a bouncer. I am the wall. I put every ounce of my authority, every ounce of the terror Sterling had instilled in me, into that invisible rope. I gave a final heave. The mime went flying backward, stumbling over the velvet rope and landing hard on the gravel. The moment he crossed the threshold back to the outside, the sound returned. The roar of the swamp hit me like a physical blow. The cicadas screamed. The mime scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a snarl of hate. He raised a hand to cast another silent spell, but I was faster. I grabbed the heavy iron stanchion of the velvet rope and swung it. Real iron beats, imaginary walls. I connected with his shoulder. There was a sickening crunch, not a bone, but something like dry plaster crumbling. He recoiled, clutching his arm, and hissed, a sound like a tire leaking air. He glared at me one last time, turned, and sprinted into the darkness, moving with the scuttling speed of a spider. I collapsed into the folding chair I kept behind the podium. My throat was bruised, purple fingerprints blooming on my skin where no hand had touched me. These shifts were the ones that scarred me. The weeper took my memories. The screaming soul took my empathy. The mime took my sense of security in reality itself. I was being hollowed out, piece by piece. And the worst part, I couldn't quit. I had tried. Once after the mime incident, I didn't show up. I stayed in my apartment, locked the doors, and turned off the lights. At sundown, my phone rang. It was unplugged, but it rang anyway. When I didn't answer, the knocking started. Not at the door, but from inside the closet, from under the bed, from the mirrors. Sterling's voice had drifted through the cracks in the floorboards. The shift begins, Elias. Attendance is mandatory. Absence is complicated. I was back at the podium within the hour. But the true horror wasn't the patrons. It wasn't the mime or the weeper. It was the slow realization of what lived in the basement of the Limbo Lounge. The entities I dealt with at the door were just the customers. I hadn't yet met the management, or rather, the things the management kept as pets. It was during a shift in the dead of August, when the heat was so thick you could chew it, that I first encountered the void whisperers and the parasitic horrors known as soul suckers. I thought I knew fear. I thought I knew the rules. But as I stood there, wiping the plaster dust of the mime off my shirt, I saw something moving in the shadows of the roofline. Something that didn't want to get in or out. Something that was hunting me. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. The witching hour. The time when the veil is thinnest and the things that don't belong in heaven or hell come out to play. I gripped my salt taser and straightened my tie. The night was far from over, and I had a feeling the next guests weren't going to be as polite as a mime. Next, I called out to the empty road, my voice shaking only slightly. From the fog, a shape began to coalesce. Not a person, not a ghost, a swarm. I realized then that the rules on the clipboard had a back page, and I had forgotten to read it. The swarm moved with a hive-mind intelligence, a shifting cloud of darkness that blotted out the moonlight. As it drew closer to the velvet rope, the individual components became visible, and my blood ran cold. They weren't insects. They were tiny, floating mouths. Hundreds of them, lipless, circular maws filled with needle-like teeth, fluttering on wings made of shadow. These are the void whispers. Sterling hadn't warned me about them directly, but I had seen the scribbled notes in the margins of a logbook left by the previous bouncer, the one whose eyes the weeper now wore. Beware the chatter. They don't bite the flesh, they bite the silence. The swarm descended, hovering just outside the boundary of the neon light. They didn't attack. They didn't try to cross the rope. They just whispered. It started as a low hum, like a distant generator, but quickly resolved into distinct voices. They weren't random. They mimicked people I knew. "You're a failure, Elias." My father's voice rasped from a dozen tiny mouths. "Look at you, a glorified doorman for the damned. You could have saved her." My ex-girlfriend's voice cried out, overlapping with the first. "You always run away. Just let go. A third voice urged. My own voice, sounding tired and defeated. Open the rope. Walk into the swamp. It's peaceful there. I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. This was psychological warfare. The whispers didn't need to physically hurt you. They eroded your will to live. They fed on despair, picking at the scabs of your psyche until you bled out emotionally. If I listened too long, I'd step off the gravel and let the swamp take me just to make it stop. Shut up. I screamed, my voice raw. Rule number 1, ID or leave. The swarm laughed, a chattering, wet sound that made my skin crawl. They swirled closer, emboldened by my reaction. They were testing the perimeter, looking for a weakness in the wards that protected the entrance. I grabbed the salt taser, but shooting a swarm was useless. I needed something else. I remembered the heavy iron bell hanging by the doorframe, a relic I had assumed was decorative. Sterling called it the clarity chime. I lunged for the bell and rang it. The sound was pure and piercing, a single crystalline note that cut through the humid air like a laser. The effect on the whispers was instantaneous. The note disrupted their frequency. The tiny mouths shrieked in unison, their shadow wings dissolving. They popped like soap bubbles, vanishing into puffs of foul-smelling smoke. I leaned against the doorframe, panting. The silence returned, but it felt fragile now. I knew they were still out there, waiting for the bell's resonance to fade. But the whispers were just the scavengers. The predators were far worse. Later that same night, around 4:30 a.m., the atmosphere shifted again. The heavy, oppressive heat of the swamp vanished, replaced by a dry, static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. The smell of ozone and burnt copper filled the air. A figure emerged from the club, not entering, but exiting. It wasn't a patron. It was something that lived in the basement. It looked human at first glance, a tall, thin man in a ragged tuxedo. But as he stepped into the light, I saw the truth. His skin was translucent, stretching tight over bones that moved independently of his joints. Inside his chest, where a heart should be, a pulsating, purple light throbbed. This was a soul sucker, a parasite that latched onto the energy of the venue. He locked eyes with me. His pupils were horizontal slits like a goat's. Fresh meat. He hissed, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. Sterling keeps hiring them younger and younger. I gripped the salt taser, aiming at his chest. Back inside. Staff aren't allowed outside during operating hours. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. I'm not staff, boy. I'm a shareholder. He moved faster than my eyes could track. 1 second he was by the door. The next he was in front of me, his hand clamped around my wrist. His touch was scorching hot. I screamed as I felt my energy, my actual life force, being siphoned out. My vision blurred, gray spots dancing in front of my eyes. It felt like my blood was turning to sand. So much potential. The soul sucker purred, leaning in to inhale the breath I was struggling to draw. So much wasted time. I dropped the taser. My knees buckled. I was dying. This was it. Not by a ghost, but by a leech. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors slammed open with a force that shook the foundation of the building. Release him. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a collapsing star. It was a sound that didn't just vibrate in the air. It vibrated in the marrow of your bones. The soul sucker froze. The purple light in his chest dimmed instantly. He released my wrist and scrambled back, cowering like a beaten dog. Mister, Mr. Proprietor, the creature stammered, bowing low, his forehead touching the gravel. I was just testing the new hire. I looked up, gasping for air, clutching my burned wrist. Standing in the doorway was a figure I had only heard rumors of. The proprietor. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man in his late 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than my entire life's earnings. He had salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed beard. But his eyes were voids. Not black, but empty, like looking into deep space. And his shadow didn't match his body. It stretched out behind him, long and twisted, with horns and wings that shifted and writhed on the floorboards. "We do not eat the staff, Azazel," the proprietor said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Good help is hard to find, and Elias has been adequate." He looked at me. I felt exposed, like an ant under a magnifying glass. He knew everything about me, my debts, my fears, the memory I had sold to the Weeper. "Get back to the pit," the proprietor commanded, not even looking at the creature. The soul sucker didn't hesitate. He scuttled backward into the club, disappearing into the dark, smoky interior. The proprietor stepped out onto the gravel. He took a silver cigarette case from his pocket, lit a cigarette with a snap of his fingers, and inhaled deeply. "Rough night, Elias?" he asked, blowing a ring of blue smoke. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry as dust. "You're doing well," he continued, as if discussing the weather. "Most don't last the first week. You have a certain resilience, a numbness that serves you well here." He walked over to the edge of the light and looked out at the swamp. "Do you know why I built this place here in the middle of this godforsaken wetland?" I shook my head, terrified to speak. "Because the veil is thin where the water meets the land," he said. "It's a natural purgatory. Wet, hot, miserable. It primes the soul for transition, or for punishment." He turned back to me, and for a split second, his human mask slipped. I saw the fire beneath the skin, the ancient, burning intelligence that predated humanity. "But remember, Elias," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "you are here to watch the door, not to understand what lies behind it. Curiosity is the one sin I do not forgive." He flicked his cigarette onto the gravel, where it hissed and burned a small black hole in the stone. "Finish your shift. Sterling will have your pay." With that, he turned and walked back inside. The doors closed silently behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the burn mark on the gravel. I was shaking uncontrollably. Meeting the proprietor was worse than fighting the mime or the Weeper. They were monsters. He was the architect of the monsters. He was the reason this nightmare existed. And he had called me adequate. I looked at my burned wrist. The skin was red and blistered, shaped like a handprint. It would scar, a permanent reminder of my employment. I checked my watch. 5:45 a.m. The sun would be up soon. The patrons would fade back into the ether, and the club would go dormant. I had survived another night. But as the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the cypress trees, lifting the fog, I realized something that chilled me more than the soul sucker's touch. I wasn't just working here. I was becoming part of the ecosystem. The numbness the proprietor mentioned, it was true. I felt less fear now, but I also felt less joy, less hope. The Weeper had taken memory. The job was taking my humanity. I walked to my car as the neon sign buzzed and flickered off. The silence of the morning swamp was deafening. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked older. darker. There were shadows under them that no amount of sleep would cure. I started the engine. It coughed and sputtered, mirroring my own exhaustion. I had to get out. I had to quit. But how do you resign from a job where the boss is an ancient entity and the severance package is your soul? I drove down the gravel road, leaving the Limbo Lounge behind in the mist. But I knew, with a sinking dread in my gut, that I hadn't really left. The lounge was inside me now, and tonight, when the sun went down, the phone would ring. The knock would come from the closet, and I would answer. Because the only thing scarier than working at the Limbo Lounge was finding out what happened to the people who try to leave. I needed a plan, a loophole, a way to break the contract before the contract broke me. I spent the daylight hours not sleeping, but researching, digging into folklore, into old property records of the Everglades, looking for anything that could give me leverage. And then, buried in a dusty archive of Seminole legends and 1920s bootlegger history, I found it. A reference to the Gateway of the Sun, a theoretical exit clause for those trapped in the service of the underworld. It was a long shot, a suicide mission really, but as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in the colors of a bruise, I knew I had to try. Tonight would be my last shift, one way or another. I was going to escape the Limbo Lounge, or I was going to become its permanent resident. The drive back to the Limbo Lounge for what I had decided would be my final shift felt less like a commute and more like a funeral procession for my own soul. The Florida heat was suffocating, a wet wool blanket wrapped around the world. But inside my car, the air conditioning was blasting at max, and I was still sweating bullets. On the passenger seat beside me lay a printed stack of pages from the archived Seminole legends and a rusty crowbar I had bought at a pawn shop in Ochopee. My research had uncovered a loophole buried deep in the lore of the swamp. The Limbo Lounge wasn't just a building. It was a pocket dimension anchored to the physical world by darkness. The archive spoke of the Gateway of the Sun, not a physical door, but a condition. The contract binding a guardian to the threshold was predicated on the maintenance of the barrier. If the barrier failed, if the purifying light of the day star breached the sanctuary of the lounge while the guardian stood his post, the contract would be voided. The venue would be compromised, the shift terminated, and the guardian ejected. It sounded simple. Keep the doors open at sunrise. But in a place where time bent and the shadows had teeth, simple was often synonymous with suicide. I pulled on a gravel road. The neon sign was already buzzing, casting its sickly green glow over the mist. The humidity pressed against the windows. I killed the engine, took a deep breath that tasted of stale recycled air and fear, and grabbed the crowbar, tucking it into my belt under my black jacket. Sterling was waiting for me at the podium. He didn't look at his watch this time. He was staring at me, his milky violet eyes narrowing as I approached. "You're late, Elias," he said softly, "and you smell of treason." "Traffic," I lied, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "Gators on the road." Sterling smiled, a thin, paper-cut stretching of his pale lips. "There are worse things on a road than reptiles. You seem burdened tonight. Heavier." He glanced at my waist where the crowbar was hidden. He knew. Of course he knew. You can't hide intent from a creature that smells fear like cologne. "Just ready to work, Sterling," I said, stepping behind the podium. "We shall see," he murmured. "The proprietor is watching. Tonight is a harvest night. The moon is waning. The shadows are hungry. Do not disappoint us." He turned and vanished inside, but not before leaving the heavy mahogany door cracked slightly open. A taunt, or perhaps a test. The shift was a nightmare from the first minute. The house knew I was planning to leave, and it turned the hostility up to 11. The guests weren't just sad or confused tonight. They were aggressive. A burn man tried to set the velvet rope on fire with his touch. I had to use the salt taser to drive him back, the smell of charred meat filling the air. A siren of the swamp, a woman with gills and shark eyes, tried to hypnotize me into walking into the ditch, her voice a melodic drill in my skull. I had to bite my own tongue until I tasted copper to break the trance. Every hour felt like a week. I checked my watch constantly. 2 a.m., 3:30 a.m., 4:45 a.m. The air grew heavier. The void whispers returned, swarming the roofline, but they didn't whisper this time. They screamed. A cacophony of accusations and failures raining down on me, trying to break my concentration. "You'll never make it," they shrieked. "He owns you. You belong to the dark." I rang the clarity chime so hard I thought the iron would crack, scattering them for a few precious minutes. But my ears were ringing, and a migraine was blinding me. Then came the silence. The absolute, terrifying silence that signaled the arrival of management. It was 5:30 a.m. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten, turning from black to a deep, bruised purple. The green flash of sunrise was 30 minutes away. The doors opened. The proprietor stepped out. He wasn't smoking this time. He looked impeccable, his suit absorbing the faint light, but his face was thunderous. He didn't walk. He arrived. One moment he was in the doorway. The next he was standing in front of the podium, looming over me. "I'm disappointed, Elias," he said. His voice didn't sound like a man anymore. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. "I offered you purpose. I offered you a wage beyond your station, and you seek to break the seal. I want out," I said, gripping the podium. "I didn't sign up for eternity." "You took the coin," the proprietor countered. "You took the memories. You were woven into the fabric of this place. You cannot leave. The exit fee is higher than you can afford." He reached out a hand. His fingers were elongating, turning into claws of shadow. "Return to your post. Close the doors. Forget the sun, or I will feed you to the weeper myself." I looked at the horizon. The purple was bleeding into orange. 5:45 a.m. "No," I said. The proprietor snarled, his human mask dissolving to reveal the burning, void-like entity beneath. He lunged. I didn't fight him. You can't fight a god in his own temple. Instead, I pulled the crowbar. I wasn't aiming for him. I swung the crowbar with all my strength at the hinge of the heavy mahogany door. The metal clang echoed like a gunshot. I jammed the curved end of the bar into the gap between the door and the frame, wrenching it back. "What are you doing?" The proprietor roared, recoiling as if the sound of the metal on the wood caused him physical pain. "Letting some fresh air in," I yelled. I kicked the wedge of the doorstop away and slammed the crowbar deeper into the hinge mechanism, bending the metal so the door physically couldn't close. "Sterling," the proprietor bellowed. "Remove him." Sterling materialized from the shadows, moving with blurring speed. He grabbed me by the throat, lifting me off my feet. His grip was ice, burning my skin. "Foolish boy," Sterling hissed, his violet eyes wide with panic. "Do you know what you've done? The light, it burns." "That's the point." I choked out. I kicked Sterling in the chest, but it was like kicking a concrete pillar. He tightened his grip. My vision began to spot. I was going to die here, minutes before the sunrise, suspended in the grasp of a dead man. But then, I remembered the weeper. I remembered what she had taken from me. The sunset, the memory of warmth. The house thrived on taking, on consumption. But what happened if you gave it something it couldn't digest? I reached into my pocket. I hadn't just brought a crowbar. I had brought a mirror. A small, cosmetic compact mirror I had stolen from a drugstore. I angled it. The first ray of the Florida sun was just cresting the tree line. A piercing, golden lance of pure light cutting through the swamp fog. It hit the mirror in my hand. I twisted my wrist, angling the reflection directly into Sterling's face. The effect was catastrophic. Sterling screamed, a sound that wasn't human, a sound like tearing metal. The focused sunlight hit his pale, parchment skin and ignited it. He dropped me, clawing at his face as smoke poured from his eyes. I hit the gravel, gasping for air. The proprietor was shielding his eyes, his shadow wings wrapping around him like a cloak. The light was poison to them. It was truth, and they were made of lies. Close the door. The proprietor shrieked, his voice losing its power, becoming thin and reedy. I scrambled to my feet. The sun was rising fast now, the day star burning away the mist. The beam of light was creeping up the gravel, inching toward the threshold I had jammed open. I ran to the door, not to close it, but to defend it. "Order up," I yelled, grabbing the velvet rope and throwing the stanchion into the lobby. The sunlight hit the threshold. It crossed the line. The reaction was instantaneous. The moment the natural light touched the interior floorboards of the Limbo Lounge, the building screamed. It was a structural groan, the sound of wood warping and nails popping. The neon sign exploded in a shower of sparks. The sickly green light died, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving clarity of the morning. The proprietor let out a howl of rage that shook the ground. He began to dissolve, his form breaking apart into swarms of flies and ash. "You are marked Elias," he roared as he disintegrated. "You may leave the lounge, but the lounge will never leave you. We will see you in the dark." Then the shockwave hit. A blast of pressure erupted from the open door, an ejection of all the pent-up supernatural energy. It hit me like a freight train. I was lifted off my feet and thrown backward, flying through the air. I crashed into the ditch on the other side of the road, the muddy, brackish water swallowing me whole. I thrashed in the water, panic seizing me as I expected the tentacles of the swamp things to grab me. But there was nothing. No monsters, just mud and weeds. I surfaced, gasping, spitting out swamp water. I dragged myself up the bank, coughing until my lungs burned. I looked across the road. The Limbo Lounge was gone. In its place stood the ruins of an old plantation house, collapsed and covered in ivy. The roof was caved in. There was no neon sign, no mahogany doors. Just a rotting frame that looked like it hadn't been inhabited for 50 years. The gravel lot was overgrown with weeds. My car was parked in a patch of tall grass, looking abandoned. I lay on the side of the road for a long time, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. The heat was returning, but felt different now. It was just heat. It wasn't oppressive. It was real. I checked my pocket. The mirror was cracked. I checked my wrist. The burn mark from the soul sucker was still there, vivid and angry, a scar shaped like a handprint. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked to my car. It started on the first try. I drove away without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a diner in Naples, 50 miles away. I ordered coffee and sat in a booth, watching the people, normal people, eating eggs, complaining about the weather, reading the news. They had no idea. They had no idea that just down the road, there was a doorway to hell that had been held open by a desperate guy with a crowbar. I quit the job. Obviously, I moved 3 states away to a place where it snows, far from the humidity and the swamp. I got a job working days in a warehouse. It's boring. It's repetitive. It's wonderful. But the proprietor was right. The lounge didn't leave me. I can't sleep with the lights off anymore. If a room is too dark, I start to hear the whispering. Sometimes when I look in a mirror, I don't see my own eyes. I see the milky violet stare of Sterling, watching me, waiting. And there's one more thing. I kept a clipboard. I don't know why. I grabbed it when I ran, maybe as proof, maybe as a trophy. I keep it locked in a safe. But sometimes, late at night, I can hear the pages turning. Last night, I took it out. The red ink had faded on the first few pages. But on the last page, there was a new entry, written in fresh, wet crimson. Rule 7. The gatekeeper may take a leave of absence, but the shift never truly ends. We will keep your seat warm, Elias. See you at sundown. I burned the clipboard in my sink. But this morning, when I woke up, the smell of sulfur was in my bedroom, and there was a single silver coin on my nightstand. I'm free of the Limbo Lounge, for now, but I know the truth about the night shift. You don't just clock out. You just wait for the next call back. And next time, I don't think they're going to let me use the door. So, if you're ever driving through the Everglades at night, and you see a neon sign buzzing where it shouldn't be, don't stop. Don't look at the bouncer. And for God's sake, don't ask for a job application, because the benefits are terrible and a retirement plan is eternal.